Okay, good evening. I'm Marge Cavalier. I'm on the Historic Preservation Commission, so I'm vice chair of that. And I'm also part of the subcommittee that's been working with our consultant, Stephen. Welcome. There's order in the back. Working with our consultant, Stephen. Another member of the HPC is here, Anthony. You just want to kind of wave. And then a third member from the HPC, Karen, was also on the committee, and also the president of the River Center was also on that committee, as was Shauna, who is kind of the first person you go to get applications done. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of history about the HPC. And then Stephen's really most of the meeting giving you an idea about what we're doing. So if you're not familiar, the HPC was reconstituted through an ordinance in 2024. And you can access that and find out what our charge is. But so I'm just gonna pick out a couple of pieces to kind of give you an idea of how we came here tonight. So whereas the borough is empowered by the New Jersey Municipal Land Use Law to establish and empower a Historic Preservation Commission to protect historic districts and sites and to enforce the regulations established within the borough. And then within the ordinance, we are given certain charges, powers, responsibilities. So I'm just going to pick out the ones that are relevant for tonight. So number one, to identify, record, and maintain a survey of building structures, sites, objects, improvements, and districts of historical significance within the borough. The last time that was done was 2009. So yeah, so one of the things that we've done in the last 2 years is gone around, walked around the town and looked at and identified structures that are in the districts that are contributing and non-contributing. So we updated that. And then, we really needed help with what are our guidelines, and with a grant to the Historic Trust, we were able to hire Stephen. And so the subcommittee has been working since May to come up with the guidelines, which were approved by the entire commission last night. And were then sent up to the planning committee. So it then has to go to the town council. And if they approve it, then it will be incorporated and added to our charge as something that we as commissioners would have to consider when some application comes before us. So I'm just going to pick up this so something, it will look like this. Hopefully there won't be any more changes, and people will be able to access this on the website. And you also will be able to buy this on Amazon, a hard copy, for $25. So that would be one of the purposes, to come up with design guidelines. And then the other piece of it would be to complete another survey, which is what we're working on now. And we're going to be, or Stephen is helping us, a survey of 75 historic buildings in the business district. So we're not looking at a survey at this point anyway of residential buildings. So there will be something like this that will list 75 surveys. So you can also see the kind of history, who owned it, historical pictures of the piece. So that's why we're here tonight, to give you an opportunity to ask questions. And of course, you could always come to the HPC meetings if you're considering some kind of changes to your home before you actually put in the application. We're willing to give you feedback. You don't have to wait until the last minute to come and talk to us. There are people who are architects on the committee, people who are very familiar with the history of Red Bank. So we more than welcome that give and take before you're actually putting an application in to do some work on your home or your rental property. So with that said, I'll just turn it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Marjorie. Good evening, everyone. My name's Stephen Smolin. I'm an architect. I live in Hoboken, New Jersey. And I've served on my local Historic Preservation Commission there for about 10 years now. And I practice architecture in New Jersey. And on the side, run a consulting firm called Architectural Heritage Consultants that helps HPCs all across the state from Montclair all the way down to Cape May, do preservation planning projects like design guidelines. So this is going to be an interactive presentation. So I'd like to just start quickly around the room with a show of hands if anyone has anything to say about what makes the place they live special. What do you enjoy about Red Bank?
Walkability.
Walkability.
The history.
The history.
A river.
River, of course, it could be frozen soon.
We hope. Last year it was boating again.
Yeah,
Sort of.
ice boating. Anything else?
I think that, you know, one of the successes of Broad Street is a place where people go,
Mhm.
irrespective of the battle over the closing, is because of those old buildings.
Mhm.
And what I call compression, you know, when stuff is close together, it feels better. And also the variety of the buildings being so different, as you can Art Deco in 19, it's 21, you know, just have. But I think people don't realize how much this influences how they feel in physical space.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that in this presentation.
Well, and the culture and art that's available here.
Yeah.
And the transportation, mass transportation available.
And that's been a thing since the 1830s.
Since the ferries, since the
1830s,
ferries in the
steamships.
1830s and the trolleys that went down Broad Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the entertainment venue is 100 years old.
And the historic homes, of course.
Yes, most of them.
Okay, so the agenda for this presentation is going to cover 6 topics. I'm going to give you a little bit more detailed overview of the project that I've been working on with the HPC. We'll talk about maintaining historic integrity in the town, navigating the different regulations related to historic preservation. And we'll of course talk about the new design guidelines. Places, resources, places to go for help we'll talk about, and then I'll take any questions people have at the end. And if you're with us on Zoom, you can type in questions at any time and I'll answer them all together at the end. So the learning objectives for this presentation include understanding the purpose of these new historic design guidelines, learning how to maintain historic integrity using them. When is HPC review required? When is it not? How does the process work? It's really not that scary. It's pretty straightforward. We'll talk about that. Recognizing what an appropriate compatible design is for the historic district. And then of course, identifying where you can go for more help. So the project that I've been working on started back in May, and we're all the way down here in November. But the way that this developed, like Marjorie said, was we had a subcommittee of different stakeholders from, of course, the HPC, the River Center, and borough staff, helping develop and provide feedback on iterative drafts of the design guidelines, and now we're working on the surveys. There's 2 components to the project. One is the historic design guidelines, and the other is the architectural surveys. The focus of tonight is the guidelines, which tell you how to preserve, and then the surveys will be more about what and why to preserve, and that's going to be confined to the commercial Broad Street Historic District. So the guidelines apply really to any historic resources, especially the locally designated districts in Red Bank, which we'll talk about, and the architectural surveys, on the other hand, are just confined for the Broad Street Commercial District. This is how the guidelines look, and this is how the surveys so far are looking. So preservation is not about freezing things in time, it's more about managing change sensitively. Red Bank, I think as we all know, has a very long and storied and important history, starting with the Navesink River and the trade that brought in the 18th century, emerging as a really major commercial hub for Monmouth County in the 19th century, steamboat service coming in the 1830s, railroad connections later that century, all the way up to New York City. And it really transformed a small fishing village into this metropolitan area that we live in today. And much of it does still have intact historic Victorian streetscapes and a business district that still has quite a bit of history from the turn of the century. So the definition of historic preservation, there's a bunch of different ones out there. I think a good one is that it's the identification, evaluation, and protection so historic resources can continue to serve the community. We're talking about blending heritage, sustainability, and economic development. Much of the appeal of Red Bank comes from its adaptive reuse over the last 100 years of historic buildings to meet modern needs today. Another key term is historic significance. If you come to an HPC meeting ever, you'll hear this term thrown around a lot. It's a decision about what is important from the past, why a place matters. And there's 4 criteria related to that. It could be an event like the steamboat era in Red Bank, a person like Eisner, the Eisner factory that we hear about, design or construction like Italianate or neoclassical commercial buildings on Broad Street, or information potential such as the Washington Street District, being a very intact and an interesting place to learn about what the pre-automobile working class neighborhood looked like in the late 1800s. The 2 historic districts, and I'll show you on the map where they are exactly, are the Broad Street Historic District and the Washington Street Historic District. Those 2 historic districts have confined periods of significance from when an important historical event happened. Like in Broad Street, that would be the construction of the original Globe Theater, Globe Hotel, to around the mid-1950s is, I think, when you can draw a cutoff for when the period of significance ended, when like the white street parking lot was created. It was probably the end of the Broad Street Historic District's period of significance. The Washington Street Historic District, the residential area, on the other hand, probably has a little bit more limited period of significance that would run from the middle of the 1800s up until between World War I and II, roughly. Another term is historic integrity. So this is the ability of the building to convey its historic significance, and it's the retention of essential characteristics or authenticity that need to be preserved in order to convey historic significance. Now, this term is based on 7 different criteria: where the property was constructed, what its design is, what the setting, the context of it is, what materials were used to build that, the craft of the building, how the materials were put together. Does it have a historic feeling when you look at it? When you look at the Monmouth Boat Club, it's an old building, you can feel that. You can probably feel it when the deck shakes too. And its association to important historical events or people like ice boat racing. An example of a building in Red Bank that over the last 200 years has lost some of its historic integrity would be the Globe Hotel. Pictured roughly as it looked 150 years ago, and of course today as we know it on Front Street on the right. This has lost its integrity of design, materials, and workmanship because of successive alterations, chopping off the sides, putting a large veranda on the front. And this building today has what you would say is a low or maybe medium low degree of historic integrity or authenticity remaining. At the end of the day, historic preservation maintains integrity, and that's what allows Red Bank to share its historical significance with future generations. So now we're going to talk about navigating historic preservation regulations. And I'm going to start at the top and work down to the local level here, just to give full context. Current historic preservation in the United States traces its roots back to the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This is where we get the National Register of Historic Places. It still exists today. There's a dozen buildings in Red Bank listed on the National Register of Historic Places. New Jersey, 4 years later, adopted a similar act, our Historic Preservation Places Act in 1970, and from that we get the State Register of Historic Places. Working our way down to the local level, here in any of the 550 some odd towns in New Jersey, they operate under municipal land use law, and a 1985 amendment to that provided for local historic preservation ordinances and eventually commissions. The current situation with historic preservation commissions did not exist prior to 1985. They've all kind of been reestablished or created between now and 1985. So municipal land use law is what your town council has to follow. It's what your planning board, the zoning board, and the HPC all follow. And municipal land use law is where the HPC gets their authority to review and regulate designated historic resources. Also in municipal land use law is where HPCs get their ability to provide design criteria or guidelines. This book. Local preservation ordinances are the only way to regulate privately owned historic properties in New Jersey. Being on the National Register, even being on the State Register, if you're a private property owner, doesn't mean anything to you. Here in Red Bank, the Historic Preservation Commission does a few things. Marjorie already went over many of these. There's a Historic Preservation Plan element. In 2008, they advised the Planning and Zoning Board on applications affecting designated properties. They review exterior alterations. They identify a list of historic sites and buildings to consider designating. And they advise on ordinances or master plan things affecting historic resources, and also provide educational outreach and seek grants to fund projects like this one. The HPC in Red Bank has 7 regular members and 2 alternate members, and an attorney and a secretary. In order for an application to get passed by the Red Bank HPC, it needs a majority vote from those present. The people that are on the HPC are all volunteers. They're offering their time up on Wednesday nights, and they are typically skilled in building design, construction, local history, and architectural history as well. This is a picture of your master plan from 2023. Within that master plan is a map. There are 2 zones there highlighted in purple. Those are your 2 locally designated historic districts, and I'll show those on a larger map in a sec. So these are them. This one here on the left is the Broad Street Historic District, so that's much of Broad Street down to Reckless Place, Monmouth Street, here to Maple, I believe.
Yeah.
And then this portion of Front Street. Over here is the residential Washington district. So that's Mechanic, Washington, Wallace, and a few of the side streets as well. The HPC within those 2 districts reviews exterior work that you can see from the street. So changes to the appearance of the building, putting an addition on, the top, the side of the house, they would review that. Replacing the whole porch, they would review that. If you do a new construction project, you have a clear site or a demolition, the HPC would review that in these two historic districts. On the other hand, the HPC does not ever review anything to do with the inside of your house. They have no purview over the interiors, they don't care what you do, that's up to you. They also do not review landscaping or painting. You can paint your house whatever color you want. If you'd like advice on a historically appropriate paint color, I'm sure they could give you that, but it's up to you what color you paint your house. Also, what's called ordinary maintenance and repair. So you're replacing wood siding with a little wood siding, that would fall under that. And if you have any questions, if your project qualifies for ordinary maintenance or not, you can talk to the town and I think specifically Shauna about that to verify if you need approvals or not. Okay, this is the first of a dozen questions. Which of the following activities in local historic districts does not require review by the HPC? Changing a roof material, replacing a side window, enclosing a front porch, adding a fence, or painting the front facade. E. E is correct. So this is the process for how an application would get reviewed by the HPC. First, the property owner submits a development permit application to the Planning and Zoning Department at Town Hall. From there, the Planning and Zoning Department would refer it into one of 4 tracks, depending on what type of application it is. If it's simple, straightforward, ordinary maintenance and repair, you can probably get approval for that at the counter very quickly from the administrative officer. If it's a minor application, where you're not doing very much work at all, it gets referred to the Minor Work Review Committee, and they start looking at it, I believe, over email in short order, and can get back to you very quickly on whether or not that's approved or not. If it's a project that requires a certificate of appropriateness, like putting an addition on a house, that's going to a Historic Preservation Commission hearing. They're held monthly, and the commissioners get your materials, I think, 10 days before the meeting. And similar for a demolition application. If you're demolishing your house, it's going to a public hearing in front of the HPC. After this part, the administrative officer approves it. You get a permit if you need one. If the Minor Works Committee denies the application, it's not the end of the road. You go to the planning board with that advisory report. And then for the other 2 paths, the HPC is sending advisory reports to the planning board. You should always contact the zoning office to verify the nature of your project if you have questions. So within the 2 locally designated historic districts, there's broadly speaking 2 types of buildings. There are those that are contributing to the historic district and those that are called non-contributing buildings. They're not contributing to the historic district. The contributing buildings are what we think of as the very historic, old, important buildings, like these in the Broad and Washington Street districts. These are present, these were present during the district's period of significance. They retain their historic character and integrity, and they contribute to the overall historic significance of the district. On the other hand, non-contributing buildings, which are still part of the district, are those that are not very historic because they were not present during the period of significance. So for example, in the Broad Street Historic District, that's going to be pretty much any building that was constructed after 1955. So stuff from the 60s, 70s, and 80s falls into this non-contributing building category. It's also possible, like this example here in the top right, that was a very old building originally, but it's been altered so significantly that it no longer conveys its historic significance. There's been vinyl siding, a dormer, I think was put on the back of the side. There's that peaked gable on the front. It's a non-contributing building. The design guidelines have two different sets of guidelines for the contributing buildings or the non-contributing buildings. The HPC is not reviewing a building from 1850, the same that they would be reviewing a building from 1995. There's two different sets of guidelines. Though the guidelines for non-contributing buildings are going to be a lot more flexible for the newer building. This is a property report for 2 Broad Street. This is part of the survey side of the project. And like Marjorie said, this has a lot of information on it. It kind of looks like maybe a tax return. It has a picture of the building, a description of its history, who owned it, when was it built, what different stores have been there. It's a kind of interesting history on each and every building in the Broad Street district that are contributing. There, on the second page of every survey is a brief description of its setting, like where it exists in the context of the historic district. There's a map, and then most importantly, here at the end is the designation as to whether or not it's a contributing building or a non-contributing building. And this description here explains why it would be that way.
Who comes up with this property report?
I do.
Oh, you, for these houses around here in Red Bank, I mean?
So as part of this project, I'm writing 75 of these for the old buildings in the Broad Street Commercial District.
Will you be doing that for all the buildings in Red Bank?
Only at Broad Street so
Not
far.
unless we pay him to do it.
Okay.
It's a big effort. They did that in Hoboken, had maybe 2,000 properties surveyed a little while ago, and it took a number of years.
But also, sorry,
okay.
if you go on Monmouth County's website, the county's historic sites area, they have individual surveys of Washington Street. So these surveys actually were done for a lot of properties on the Washington Street
Mhm.
Historic District. So you can find old ones
Okay.
that's related to this, but Stephen's working on the ones that weren't done for Broad Street.
And
And updating.
And another PS, one of the things that the HPC has been charged with doing is establishing additional districts.
Mhm.
So if we want to do that, then we have to provide a property report, which Shona can do locally to decide whether it would be another district designated. And the one map that you had up there before, we also have individual properties that are designated outside of these districts, also with the town.
But also I'll try to have, as I'm sitting here thinking, I'll have this, hopefully I can have it on the borough's website. On a historic preservation page, the survey that was done on Monmouth County from the county.
Thank you.
They've been doing surveys in Red Bank since the 80s, so it's been a long process. Okay, another question. Which of the following directly restricts a private property owner's ability to alter their building? National Register of Historic Places, State Register, Local Historic Preservation Ordinance, a local historical society report.
See,
C. If you're a government entity, it's a different answer, but a private property owner, that's it. In a historic district, what is the primary factor that determines whether a building is contributing or non-contributing? The building's architectural style matches the majority of the district. The building was constructed within the district's period of significance and retains historic integrity. The building is in good physical condition, or it's located within the historic district. B, correct. Okay, now we will finally get to talk about this historic design guidelines book. Design guidelines do and do not do several different things. So guidelines will provide people with upfront guidance and also their architects or other professionals. Design guidelines do not serve as your new building or construction code. That's the UCC, and that's what you follow for code related items like that. Design guidelines do advance the character of the historic district. They do not by themselves increase new construction or rehabilitation activities. The HPC is sitting there waiting for your application. They're never going out and writing you a letter and telling you to do something. That's up to you. Design guidelines prioritize design considerations and encourage appropriate alterations. They do not regulate density or location of development. That's your planning board and your zoning board's role. Design guidelines do improve the quality and integrity of projects. They do not, however, improve they do not improve property maintenance. There's local ordinances that cover that. The goal at the end of the day here is to encourage appropriate work and not restrict creativity. There's 3 different audiences for this design guidelines book, and we were mindful as we were writing it to make sure that we were addressing the applicant and the public that want to get something built and understand the motivation behind different changes in their community. There's design professionals like architects that want to shepherd the project from beginning to end and probably know more technical historic preservation expectations. And then there's also, going forward, the commission and staff. I think we're readily aware that the commission that exists today will probably not be the commission that exists in 10 years. People get reappointed every couple of years, and that commission in 10 years is going to need a resource to objectively review applications. The historic design guidelines fundamentally are based on what's called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. That's one of the 2 brochures some of you picked up in the back of the room there. They're all listed there. There's 10 of them. And there's also supplemental guidelines. This is put out by the National Park Service, the people that collect tolls when you drive into national parks. It's the same department. There's supplemental guidance that they have for flood adaptation and sustainability, which we also looked at in developing these design guidelines. The Park Service also puts out a litany of preservation briefs with very technical information on repairing terracotta, cast iron columns, a whole bunch of different topics, and those are referenced throughout the design guidelines as well. And there's hyperlinks when you look at it online to go right to those pages. So this is those 10 Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, as close as what the HPC has to kind of their 10 commandments. These are referenced in the ordinance, and it was really standards number 2, 5, 6, 9, and 10 that were most important. Standard number 9, for example, which no one can probably read here, says new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property. That statement by itself drives much of what you see in this design guideline book. All 50 states use these to review rehabilitation tax credits and different programs like that. And just about every HPC in New Jersey references these probably once a meeting at least. So all this different information gets distilled into the design guidelines, clear upfront guidance, objective standards is the goal here. What is the primary purpose of historic design guidelines? The mandate that all buildings remain unchanged, provide a framework for preserving historic character while allowing compatible changes, to require that all new construction imitate historic styles, or to enforce strict restoration of buildings to their original state. B is correct. The guidelines are not forcing people backwards to the late 1800s or cognizant it's 2025 and buildings need to be adapted to still serve a modern day purpose. So this is the cover and table of contents for the design guidelines. They are divided into 5 sections. There's an introduction, brief historic context, the guidelines themselves, a section related to additions and new construction, and then an appendix with a bunch of different resources, including enlargements of those 2 historic district maps. So you can see exactly by block and lot who's in the district versus not. In the introduction section, there's a map of the districts again, Washington and Broad. The review process flow chart that I talked about is there. And on the side of that page is also what qualifies for different types of applications, expedited review or regular review. That's all spelled out in that page. On page 10 is a preservation philosophy for the HPC, how they approach different projects, what a living history here in Red Bank means, how materials are handled, such as like wood versus hardy plank that's discussed on this page, and what does an authentic Red Bank mean to this Historic Preservation Commission. The following page are those Secretary of Interior standards again.
They're called the 10 Commandments in the business.
By some, yes.
Yeah.
There's a historic overview that runs for half a dozen pages. So this traces Red Bank's beginnings from before it was on any maps, breaking away from Shrewsbury. That's all chronicled there. And that builds on really why the HPC prioritizes certain buildings, and the importance of each of the different historic districts comes from this historic narrative. The following section traces probably 10 different architectural styles in the 2 historic districts. So everything from Italianate, Second Empire, stick style, Queen Anne, neoclassical, and Art Deco, when those were prevalent within the districts, is on a timeline there. And then the preceding pages dedicate a half page to each of those styles about what the character defining features one should look for in those styles, but also the HPC would use that to know what character defining features are important to be maintained during the alteration of a project. If you have a Queen Anne style building, taking off the fish scale siding or decorative siding treatment like that, that's a character defining feature, is probably not appropriate. So that's how that architectural styles section is used.
So then they could technically deny that and that person could not do the renovations they wanted to. So it's not really a guideline, they'd have to follow.
Yes, if it were as cut and dry as you have a Queen Anne style house with 120-year-old fish scale siding and you're taking it off to put up stucco, it's not appropriate.
And they'd say no.
They should say no in that instance.
I just didn't know they had the authority to say no, I was just curious.
Well, but then they could appeal. If you don't wanna take that back.
It's an advisory report.
Right.
To the planning board. There's a page in here on how to use the design guidelines. So again, a summary of what are contributing and non-contributing buildings. This is also a legend for different sidebar items you see. So when you see the ... those are links to additional guidance. Any HPC priorities are in red. And then excerpts from the Secretary of the Interior standards will be under the National Park Service shield. The page on material matters relates to the use of composite or substitute materials. The Red Bank HPC, I think, is very much in favor and has embraced modern composite materials. So I'm talking hardy plank, AZAC, polymer-based shingles that look like old slate shingles, glass fiber reinforced concrete instead of plaster, all those different modern materials that look like old and match in profile and texture readily embraced by the Red Bank HPC. And there's 8 different scenarios when using those materials are appropriate, and that's spelled out in the guidelines. And that comes right from the Secretary of the Interior standards, and that specific part was updated just 2 years ago. So it's pretty flexible now, and Red Bank is embracing that, and we're not saying no to any type of composite materials across the board.
And that's significant because some historic districts in some towns are much stricter about materials.
I worked with
Country,
Kate May on their historic design guidelines. Wood was the only option, 99% of the time. So Red Bank is a little bit more flexible in that regard. And that's because they acknowledge that a lot of alterations have happened to houses in the Washington Street district and at the ground level of storefronts in the Broad Street Historic District. So it's better that people are using maybe something more economical to get back to a historic appearance versus not doing the project at all. So a question here is, when may substitute materials be used on a historic contributing building? Only when the original material is deteriorated beyond repair and the substitute material replicates its appearance and finish. Whenever the new material is easier to install. Anytime the substitute provides better insulation. Or whenever the substitute material is available in historic colors. When is it appropriate to use a substitute material? So let's think hardy plank on a building on Washington Street. A is correct. The guidelines emphasize original materials wood typically should be repaired whenever possible and only considered for replacement when they're completely deteriorated, and the replacement should match in appearance, profile, and finish. Each of the guidelines are broken down into the different components of the building. So it starts at the top of the building with roofs. There's a summary about appropriate materials for roof replacements. Again, this is for a contributing building. So for a non-contributing building, there's more flexibility. But if you have a slate roof from 1890 and it's completely deteriorated, the only appropriate replacement for that slate roof is another slate roof. It's highly unlikely that the slates themselves at this point in time need to be replaced. Typically, they can be taken off, the underlayment repaired, and the slates be reinstalled. If you have, like the vast majority of the town, asphalt shingle roofs that were put on in the last 80 years, there's more flexibility. You can always do an asphalt roof replacement or another asphalt roof replacement. If you'd like to go back to a slate roof, go ahead. If you'd like to put a composite material that looked like historic slate and your house once had a slate roof, that's also going to be appropriate. The guidelines also include comparative pictures of appropriate versus inappropriate treatments to different buildings. Those are 2 pictures. One is an appropriate cornice restoration on Broad Street, and the other one is an inappropriate roof and a solar panel and puncturing untinted concrete and chimneys coming out the top there. The next section is about exterior cladding, so the facade of the house. The main thrust of this section is that the detailing and trim work of the facades should be preserved, even if you're changing the siding. The corner boards and the base trim should be replaced, and you should not be ending up with a picture like the house on the right where all the corner boards were taken off. The section on windows is quite detailed, and the HPC, acknowledges that windows are a recurring replacement for many homeowners, and going to true good quality wood windows is not cheap, which is why if you have vinyl or composite windows, the HPC will let you look at another set of composite windows. Ideally, people are not putting more vinyl windows into the historic district, though that's really a policy that just about every HPC that's written guidelines has agreed that vinyl windows, because of their appearance, looking really nothing like the historic window, their limited lifespan, the environmental kind of degradation issues with producing and never being able to recycle vinyl, or just an overwhelming reason to not have more vinyl windows. But the red bank HPC is favorable to different types of modern composites that look like original wood windows, which I think gives homeowners a lot of options. There's a section on porches and entrances, diagrams about appropriate framed lattice work below the porch, balusters that are held off the decking and captured by a bottom and top rail. If you have a very low railing on your porch, you can put a booster rail on the top like the middle picture shows. And ultimately, it's best to avoid vinyl lattice with the balusters coming all the way down to the deck, as indicated in the inappropriate diagram on the right. Yes.
Does the committee or restoration committee support people that do not want to raise change the height of their historic rails? I lived in Fairhaven a while ago and they were trying to talk about that they had to add 4-foot tall railings to their porches. And many of them are only, 3 foot tall. And they eventually gave up on it, but do they support leaving railings in a historically lower than code allows these days, but historically appropriate height?
So New Jersey in the late 90s was the first state to develop a rehabilitation subcode. If you believe that they developed a new law. And the rehabilitation subcode provides for a lot of flexibility for existing conditions in historic homes. Code is 42 inches. Many historic railings are down around 28 inches. So the best solution in that instance would be like the middle diagram. Let me go back to that. This is your 28-inch tall historic railing, and then it's to put a booster rail up to code 42 inches there. I think the HPC would certainly support an applicant, though, in the historic district, if they're dealing with a construction code official about modifying that railing in a sensitive way that doesn't involve ripping the whole thing out. The next section is about doors. This covers both front doors and garage doors. And there's appropriate treatments for that there too. Okay, so a question here is, what is the preferred approach for replacing roofing on a contributing building? Use any modern roofing product because roofs are not character defining. Replace historic roofs with materials that match the original in profile, texture, and color. Change the roof pitch to improve drainage. Increase the roof height for added attic space. Which is the most correct of those answers? B. B is correct. And a full roof replacement should really only be considered if it's a slate or cedar shake roof that's completely deteriorated. Asphalt shingles are not a historic material and can and should be readily replaced. Your roof isn't leaking. Which window replacement aligns with the design guidelines? A smaller vinyl replacement with simulated buttons between the glass. A new window with tinted glazing. A replacement matching the original in size, operation, button pattern, and exterior material. Or a casement window replacing a historic double hung window. C. And like I said, there is flexibility on the exterior material. It does not always need to be wood. Wood is great, wood is nice if you can afford that and you're looking to do that type of project, but there are composite alternatives. What is the proper treatment for doors on a historic contributing structure? replace with modern steel doors for increased security, install a sliding patio door on the primary facade, retain original doors and surrounds repairing when possible, or replace it with an entirely new design. C is correct. They are a character defining feature and they should be preserved. Okay, the River Center had a lot of input into the storefront and signage section because it affects much of the commercial district that they serve. So this was where we got into quite a bit of detail in the design guidelines because much of what the Red Bank HPC sees are storefronts. So this section includes a diagram you see on the right there of the different components of a historic turn of the century storefront. So starting at the bottom, it's going to be a bulkhead. Above that is the big display window, a transom light or articulated glass. Above that is a sign band and a small overhang lower cornice. Now those components, as they appear here historically, are not necessary to do on each and every new storefront project in Red Bank. We know that we're not pushing people back to how the storefront looked in 1880. That is an option and is a great option for intact contributing buildings like the one here on Wharf Ave. That would be a restoration project, but more often what people are doing are in the rehabilitation or new construction treatment categories. So a rehabilitation project, I think that's probably 7 or 8 out of 10 what the HPC sees. That's an adaptive reuse. You're taking a storefront that's been altered probably 5 or 10 times at this point, and you're creating something which is compatible and plays nice with its neighbors. It's going to have those elements like the bulkhead, the display window, and the transom, but not necessarily in the exact same way that it may have looked in 1880 or 1890. The other option would be new construction storefront. That's a great approach if it's a non-historic building, say built in the 1980s or 1990s. It's just you're starting from scratch essentially, and you're just building something that works with the historic district. And there's detailed guidance for each of those different treatments. A pure restoration project needs to define ideally an exact year or at least maybe a decade of when that storefront is being restored to. You have to do that with pictures, maybe there's drawings available, and you're working from those to do a faithful restoration. The rehabilitation option, which again is what most of the HPC is seeing, is about compatibility, adaptive reuse, composite materials, all that falls into this category, and those are different examples. This is a lot of what you see in Red Bank. Last option is new construction, and again, a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more modern, but still working harmoniously with the historic district. Following this section is a detailed set of guidelines on signage. It gets all the way down into appropriate ranges for color temperature for lighting. The room we're in right now is probably 4, maybe 5,000 Kelvin. An appropriate illumination temperature for a sign in a historic district is probably closer to 2,500 or 3,000 Kelvin in most cases. It should not be bright blue lighting or flashing LED lighting. The sign should be proportionate to the storefront, shouldn't overwhelm the facade. If there's still like historic cast iron detailing, it should not cover that. And the River Center, I think, has reviewed signage a lot through their design review committee and typically have found their way to an appropriate location on the storefront. The next section relates to site and streetscape. Many of these guidelines are really just non-binding advisory guidelines since the HPC doesn't review landscape, but it's nice when people configure their driveway or walkway in a historically appropriate way. So that's why that section is there. Okay, another question for the audience. Which of the following is an appropriate storefront alteration? Installing a flush full height glass wall that obscures historic components, retaining or reconstructing transoms, lowering the height of the display window to modernize its appearance, or D, covering historic columns with synthetic materials. B. B is correct. Thank you. Okay, the second to last section of the design guidelines deals with additions. So there are several different considerations the HPC has when they review an addition project. They include site placement, height, massing, proportion, and scale, and architectural features. We set up the design guidelines in kind of three different categories or typologies of additions. And there's appropriate and inappropriate diagrams for each. There are side and rear yard additions. So this rear addition on that building in the diagram there, it's modest in scale. It's not too easy to see from the street. That's an appropriate one. Whereas this other option, shown in red here, where the house is being almost doubled in size, it's laterally, the width is increasing quite a bit. That's an example of a typically inappropriate addition. All these applications for additions are judged on their own merits individually within the context. So in certain scenarios on a particularly large site, a large addition may be appropriate. But broadly speaking, for the smaller lots in the Washington Street district, it's great to go out the back of the house and not disrupt the streetscape too much. The second category of additions is rooftop additions. Typically, it's not appropriate to add a shed dormer to a front gable of a house. And then carriage house or accessory structure additions is also covered in this section. The last section is on new construction. So this is like a really big change in the historic district. There's a cleared site. Hopefully the HPC reviewed the demolition and signed off on that. And now something brand new is being preserved. I think the HPC is really looking to raise the bar on the quality of construction. They're not completely opposed to new, modern, contemporary design, but it does need to be thoughtful, contextual, and work with its immediate historic surrounding neighbors, and essentially not create an eyesore in the historic district is kind of what it comes down to. So the HPC is going to consider site placement, height, massing, proportion, and scale again. What all that means is spelled out in the different guidelines, and also architectural features and materials. Typically materials for a new construction project, if they're not using genuine historic materials, they should be using something that at one point in the history of Red Bank has been used before, and not introducing a completely like new shiny material that may draw quite a bit of attention to itself. What is the most appropriate location for an addition to a historic building? On the primary facade, so the addition becomes the new focal point. On the most visible elevation to showcase new architecture. On a rear or secondary elevation, subordinate in scale. Or D, anywhere on the site as long as the materials match. C is correct. The historic building at the end of the day, after an addition is put on, should remain the dominant form as part of the composition. Which of the following is the most appropriate massing approach for an addition? They may be taller than the historic building if set back by 10 feet. Addition should not overwhelm the existing building and must remain visually secondary. Additions should replicate the historic building exactly, or they can be flat roofed even if the building is steeply gabled. B, addition should not overwhelm is correct. What do the design guidelines emphasize for new construction? Exact replication of historic buildings, highly contemporary forms with no references to neighboring structures, uniformity, every new building must match its neighbor, or D, compatibility in form, scale, massing, and rhythm, and setback without necessarily mimicking historic buildings. D is correct. Okay, last section is where to go for help and further information. As I mentioned in the appendice of the historic district, now, I think for the first time ever, are 2 maps of the locally designated historic districts. These have been locally designated for a matter of years, and now there's a map in the historic design guidelines of them, like an enlarged map, because before they were very small on the big map of the town. And these define the block and lot numbers of each and every parcel in the 2 districts.
And
Is
Stephen,
that-
I'm sorry, before you move on. On the zoning map, you may not see it as the Broad Street Historic District. It's called the Design Overlay. So, just keep that in mind. If you're looking at our existing zoning map, it's called the Design District Overlay. That's actually the Broad Street Historic District. Those change. We're gonna make it more consistent when we do our zoning ordinance update, so that there is no confusion. The design overlay is the Broad Street Historic.
And both terms are used in the design guidelines. The design district overlay zone is in the smaller text.
Will the individual homes be on there?
Yes. Each of,
That aren't in the districts, in other words?
no,
Yeah.
not in the book yet.
All right,
That would come about in like a historic preservation plan element, the master plan eventually. Also in the appendice of the design guidelines is a glossary of architectural terms. There's pictures from Red Bank of many of them. And then the last page is a list of resources and a bibliography. There is also a summary brochure. We did storefronts as a topic since Broad Street has a lot of storefronts. And within that is a summary of the guidelines for the 3 different treatment methods and a QR code on the back to get access to the full design guidelines on the HPC's website. There's the map of the 2 historic districts.
That's gonna be through the Riverside.
Yes. And anyone can take one of these. There's plenty of copies left in the back.
We'll also have some of the planning and zoning office.
And lastly, I would like to thank my dedicated design guidelines committee, Marjorie, Maren from the River Center, Shauna, Karen, and Anthony, who's here as well. Thank you for your help during this time. Thank you to the New Jersey Historic Trust for providing the grant to fund this project, the Red Bank Public Library for hosting us tonight. And with that, I will now take any questions that people have on the design guidelines or the HPC maybe in general.
And could I also ask you to fill out the survey
Surveys.
form while we're doing this, because the libraries gonna start closing in 15 minutes, so. Yeah, so if while you're doing that, you can just even leave it on your seat after you're done, or hand it to one of us. So, questions?
And I'll pass this book around. The library will have a copy of this. And there'll also be one at City Hall.
Now, when you go online, can you download that?
Yes, as a
There's a draft copy now on the website,
Yes.
which is what you're saying, there's a QR code on the back of that. Little form on the right, over there.
You can also buy it on Amazon for $25.
75 to print it at
75?
Staples to print
Oh.
it, so you're better off getting.
Yeah, on Amazon. So questions?
Did anyone learn anything from this presentation?
I have one question, just because I've watched neighbors go through stuff, we're in Washington Street, and the color has always been important, so why did the painting of the colors change? Or
It didn't
it never
change,
been
it's just that,
exciting, they always
yeah,
colors
it's just that some towns have really gone hard on people to actually change the colors, and there are some houses in town that the neighbors are very upset with the colors that people have used. But it's just like, you know, how far do you wanna go? I mean, and so when people come before the HPC and they talk about redoing the color on their houses, we do ask them to consider, you know, Benjamin Moore historic colors. And we just had one last night where somebody was considering the windows, and, you know, it's a big HDTV thing where people are putting black vinyl windows on everything, which will be out of style in 20 years. So we try and get them to consider something that's more compatible with the building. So I mean, that all we can do is suggest, because again, we are advisory, you know, and that's our charge, to try and be as helpful as we can to maintain the integrity, as Stephen said, of the town. So,
Now, what about like multifamily homes, like over around like Wallace and such, that are in the district, that are just like being forgotten about?
yeah,
by
well,
landlords?
just to be quite candid, I guess I'll stand up. Just to be quite candid with you, our concern is that absentee landlords own them. And our concern is they're letting them deteriorate until they can apply to demolish them.
Visibly,
Yeah, and we actually have some slate roofs removed without going for a permit, so it's like, what's the phrase about not asking for permission? So we can't control that, we try, a lot of us on the commission walk around town all the time to see if we can get some of this
I just
stuff.
didn't know if there was any specific thing that, because they're just letting it go,
The one thing you can do is like you can make an anonymous complaint to code enforcement, and that way they can be issued a violation for, the maintenance and upkeep. But we can't actively force
people.
anyone to maintain their property unless it's like a nuisance.
If you see something specific, yeah, you can go, how do they do that? They go right
So-
on to,
On the borough's website, I believe under, I wanna say permits and applications, but I'm not 100% sure, but if you go on code enforcement, under government, code enforcement, there is a way to report online anonymously.
There's also a problem with our neighbor.
I'm still working on it a little bit, I still got some
Okay.
questions.
Okay, so the question here was, when was the committee formed? Some of the people on the HPC were on earlier iterations of the commission, but with the new form of government that we had in town 2 years ago, a lot of the commissions were reestablished. And so the HPC, as I mentioned earlier, was a new ordinance was drafted at that point that gave a more specific purpose. And also the kinds of people that are on the commission, so I'm a B, basically historical significance. Then we have people who have an architectural background, and some people that are involved in real estate, and the most recent person to be put on the HPC is Michael White, who has been doing murals around town. We just did the Camp Basie one and the airport one on West Street, so yeah.
Also, if you're interested in volunteering, or to be on a board, on the borough's website, there is a form, and that's how, it was really selected by council, because council appoints the members to each board and commission. The board itself doesn't appoint new members, it's council. So if you're interested in joining, a committee or commission, you go on the borough's website, there is a volunteer form submitted on which board you're interested in, so if there is a turnover, then they can select from that and reach out to you.
Yeah, question, I don't know who can answer it. So let's say someone lives in a historically named home and they sell it and the person wants to buy it and demolish it. They're not gonna let them do that.
You have to go through the process.
But yet something like the mushroom house can be taken down, right?
That's not in the district.
That's not, it's,
So sadly, that's not in the district. So one of the things that is in the ordinance is to extend the districts in town. So one of the things that I suggested doing, I was on the put forward the idea, was Irving Place, and they were very upset, and they said, well, you don't even have a design guideline, well, now we have a design guideline. So, Can we suggest additional protected structures or districts?
So if you
We
were to sell
certainly
your
can.
house, would you have to,
Say it's historic.
Well, the real estate agent should declare that it is to you.
but if a person buys it, you have to inform them they may not be able to take it down when every other house gets
I
taken
don't think
down?
there's a law, right, Stephen? There's not a law that requires the realtors to let you.
No, I was just wondering if if you're going to sell your home, what are the restrictions for everybody who's coming in and taking down every house and putting up whatever they want?
There is no restriction to only like the permitting process to demolish a house. So if you're going to demolish a house, as Stephen's diagram shows, first you start with the planning and zoning office. If you go to the building department first, they're gonna kick you straight to the planning and zoning office, and that's where we catch, and if it's in a historic district, and then it has to go through that process, but anything of that sort, you have to come first to planning and zoning. Everything starts first with planning and zoning, just so that everyone knows. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, do not do anything unless you contact the planning and zoning office.
But know that there are a lot of century homes in Red Bank that are not in these districts.
I have a question, where's the quickest reference to the homes you call that have houses of interest, or places of interest?
That is in the master plan.
Master plan.
And as Stephen mentioned, they are those places in Red Bank that are designated by the national level and the state level. So that does not necessarily, those are separate designations, and they don't have the protection against demolition that the ones in the district do through local ordinance.
Which is why we were adopting several of them into ordinance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
You covered a lot of stuff there, apologize if I missed it, but you covered all of the exterior of the house and garage doors. What about fencing? What's the interest?
it's in there.
There's guidelines there, but I think they're just advisory,
They're
right?
advisory, they're not regulated fencing. But again, we wanna keep it very simple, so it's really just the principal structures and accessory structure, fencing is.
But we have had people ask for
Yeah, there
advice
is-
on what the fencing should look like in a historic district.
Yeah, but we will send you, if you're in a historic district and you come to the planning and zoning office, because again, remember, everything starts with planning and zoning, for fence replacement. I won't send you to the historic commission to replace, for permission on what the materials are for the fence. If it's included in the overall application, then, you can ask the commission's, advice.
Just wanted to add something for people that I don't live in. My house was built in 2017, so it doesn't count, but it's old fashioned looking. I'm on a board and I go to some of these meetings, like council meetings, and I think in this town, with the people that are on these boards, on the side of the town, if 1, 2, 3, 4 people show up at a meeting, they can really get noticed. So it's worth, you have a group like the Irving place, people got together, started to get to know each other. Keep an eye on the commission to see what's happening, send someone to every meeting and watch what they're doing. And I think if a group of people show up, it has an impact here. This is not New York City, people are listening to you. And you saw what happened with every place, people went berserk and it was over.
No, it wasn't over, it was just that they said we didn't have design guidelines,
Yeah,
now we have design
I
guidelines.
just meant right then, but what I mean is it shows that if you,
Mrs. Marjorie's still fighting.
Urban Place is amazing, you look at the back.
Yeah, I mean, and you don't want a box truck in the middle of that street.
Yeah,
Beside-
Why did they have?
It's worth getting involved because it does have an impact, you're not hopeless on these things.
What was their real objection? So they,
They didn't wanna be told what to
the
do.
lack of guidelines was their.
Well, they-
Most of the
that-
houses are being
that-
updated and aren't actually
Yeah, they said
historical.
that there
Most of
wasn't
the
much
houses aren't historic.
historic significance, to the Urban Place properties because they've changed over time.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, based on
we didn't have.
Stephen's great presentation, it's not just about that there's someone famous or it's an old house. It's that there's some feature there that contributes to it. There could be one house that's a contributing house that's in a historic district.
Yeah.
But the rest of them are non-contributing, but it just makes up, it defines the character of what Red Bank is.
So one thing that is about Irving Place was the first street to be electrified in Red Bank. It was the first street to have mail delivered to their home that didn't have to go to one of the little post offices in town. And I personally think it's also significant. One of the people that lost their lives in the towers lived on Irving Place at that time. So, you know, you talk about Edmund Wilson Plaza, we had poet laureates, you know, we had people that designed the covers of paperback novels in town, you know.
Abigail Spanberg.
So, you know, it's not just what the house looks like, you know, and if you read the ordinance, there's other things that are important about a house, and to just have it disappear, not be protected, not give us the ability to give them advice to keep it, is just sad. You know, that you would say, well, we're gonna protect our own, that's not gonna happen to the house next to me, you don't know that. If your house is not in a protected district, they could bypass the HPC. There's not gonna be anybody arguing for them.
But also, just to let you know that anyone can nominate a district, individual landmark. You would just have to come to, the processes for designation is that first you'll go to the historic commission, make a presentation. Then if the historic commission approves it, then it moves up to the planning board, and then from the planning board, if they approve it, then the next step is council, because then it restricts, not restricts your zoning, but it impacts this, any modifications to your property, so then it's law, so.
Yeah, and some of the pictures in the design guidelines are not protected,
Yeah, well, how did you choose the properties that are in there?
because they match the architectural details that we were trying to highlight. But if you look at the Broad Street district, for example, there's some cutouts here, and like there's a part of the cookie place on Mechanic Street that just opened, I forget what the name of it is. That's in the design guidelines, but it's not included in the district when they drew the line.
So it has an asterisk next to it. Another motivation for houses that were pictured versus not was simply if they were covered by trees or not. If I could
Can I get a good gift?
If I could get a clear shot of the house, that typically was a good thing, a good light.
So are there any more questions, because the library is gonna close? And I hope everybody had an opportunity and to complete the survey, and thank you for coming.
I just wanna thank Stephen again, he's been doing a lot of work.
Yeah, very good.
Can I ask a question remotely?
Format, it's really effective.
Okay, so I guess we're